Hey everyone, at long last I am back with another Miss Marple novel. It's been honestly almost 3 years at this point since I reviewed the third Marple novel, The Moving Finger, since I've been more focused on wrapping up Hercule Poirot for a while, but it's time to give Marple her due as well. Actually, it doesn't seem like quite so long to me because I have actually read some Marple short stories in the time in between. Or rather, I've read all the Marple short stories, including even the collection of 12 new Marple mysteries written a few years ago by a contemporary women authors, so not actually by Agatha Christie herself. But here we have a mystery that I have been looking forward to for quite a while because it has quite a positive reputation, and it's easy to see why just from the title alone. A Murder is Announced starts with an interesting premise. The local newspaper, in what you could sort of think of as a classified ads section, contains an announcement of a murder to take place at a house called Little Paddocks in the village of Chipping Cleghorn. How quaint is that? So that's an interesting start, and the scene that ensues among all the guests who show up to see what it's all about is certainly intriguing. So after the first few chapters or so, I definitely was quite drawn in. Nevertheless, at the end of the day, considering the novel as a whole, how do I say this? I found it just okay. So what's the deal here? This is a novel that is 50% longer than your average Christie novel. I looked into it after finishing the book, and I'm clearly in the minority when I say I didn't absolutely love this novel. Most critics and modern readers really like it, and many cite it as their favorite Marple novel. Which, maybe to explore more deeply why that is, we'll have to wait for the spoiler section, and it's something I'm going to explore even further in some future Marple videos, but really for me this was among the weaker of the Marple novels I've read thus far. I'd probably put Body in the Library on top for me, followed by Murder at the Vicarage, followed by, I'd say for me, The Moving Finger was about tied with this one. And to be fair, I liked The Moving Finger quite a bit. So this novel isn't bad. I'll talk first about some of the things that are really good about this novel. First of all, there's a lot of Miss Marple. She's an active participant, which was not the case at all in The Moving Finger. Second of all, it does have that more cozy, small English village vibe, which I'm kind of realizing maybe that's just not the kind of setting I like so much, which explains why the Poirot novels often appeal to me more. And for example, why The Body in the Library was my favorite, since about half the action in that novel actually centers around this hotel in, I think, London, or at least in a big city. And this one is cozy even in terms of setting details. Central heating, chrysanthemums and gardens, and all sorts of flowers, butter deliveries and chocolate cake, death by chocolate. So for some readers, this aspect may be especially enjoyable, and was perhaps quite unconventional or new at the time. Also, despite some bad clues here and there that are just kind of goofy or ridiculous, there actually are quite a lot of good clues. And these clues mostly are things that you will notice, but you might just not appreciate their significance until later on. Of course, and this is starting to get into one aspect I didn't like so much about the book, there are a few clues early on that are maybe a little too good. You see, I was fairly confident I knew the culprit by about 2 hours into the book, and by halfway through, I was all but certain. This isn't necessarily such a bad thing, but it means that a lot of the side plots and misdirects that I'd be experiencing for the final 3/4 of the book were more of curiosities than things that really drew me in. And did I mention that this book is 50% longer than the average Christie novel? This seems like a length that would be hard to pull off with even the best of Christie novels, and in this one it feels to me a little inexcusable. Now, I don't think everyone is going to figure this out so early, and if you don't figure it out right at the beginning, your experience will surely be different. But if you've read a lot of Christie novels previously, there's a good chance you will be onto what's happening, particularly because there's nothing that groundbreaking here. What we're seeing on a high level is something we've already seen before, especially in one particular instance I'm thinking of that I won't give away, but for me that other novel was far more fun than this one. That said, the mystery plot in this novel is good in the sense that I buy it throughout. The clues are consistent, the way that the characters act is consistent. I feel it's totally fair of a novel to the reader, and if you understand what's going on, there are plenty of details that you really can't appreciate. But there's just so much of it. Another issue that makes it less fun to get through is that the characters, for me, are not that exciting. Okay, I feel a little bad saying this because, so I watched the Joan Hickson TV adaptation of this one right afterwards, and I actually really enjoyed that, I have to say. In fact, it helped me appreciate this novel a bit more because everything in the TV adaptation really is here in the novel as well, and made me think maybe I was just not the most receptive to this novel and its characters at the very moment I was reading it. In the TV series, the characters felt like they all had their own memorable personalities, and we saw just enough of each of them for them to really work, but not so much of them that I felt like they needed to be incredibly deep. For example, Hinchcliffe and Murgatroyd were, honestly, I think they were pretty memorable in their own way in the book as well, but I think in the TV series they are especially lovable and memorable, despite seeming to be fairly minor characters, all things considered. But returning to my criticisms, there are still probably too many of these characters, and quite a few of them that we can't totally rule out, but that most people are never going to take that seriously as a potential murderer, even if only because they're not on the page enough and aren't placed under much scrutiny. Which, admittedly, we know, of course, that can sometimes be a dangerous assumption, but still. Also, though, most of the characters are not that interesting to me. Like, maybe the longer length of the book is justifiable to give these characters long enough to shine, but I just didn't find all of them resonating as much as they sometimes do with me. There are a few quirky younger characters that are all a bit sketchy or kind of self-centered and annoying, though maybe not like the most exciting in terms of their stories. While some of the older characters, like an old English colonel and the local vicar, all seem to have as a main character trait that they're dull and monotonous. And then we have the refugee character, Mitzi, who she is one of the more memorable characters, but she really does not come across well in this book. She's mistreated by all the other characters who call her a liar and paranoid and attention-seeking and self-centered, and at least in some of those regards, her own actions immediately prove them correct. One thing that I think in particular will rub many readers the wrong way, as it did for me, is that you see, Mitzi is a refugee who fled from the Nazis and seemed to have family members who were killed by the Nazis. I think she was even in a concentration camp herself at some point, allegedly. And the other characters basically all insinuate that she is making this up to get attention and that she's just paranoid. It never really is confirmed to us that she is making this up, but she is portrayed as paranoid in a way that reflects poorly on her as a character and seems to reflect a pretty negative attitude of the English people, or even the author, to refugees at the time. It is what it is, and it may be true of the way that people thought about refugees, but it's rather unfortunate when this is one of your best characterized characters. Also, we're never really explicitly told the ethnic background of Mitzi, but I think from context clues we're given, it's reasonable to assume that she's Jewish, or at least that she was probably a German or Austrian resident belonging to some other group persecuted by the Nazis. We do get some more interesting characters in the form of Letitia, or Letty Blacklock. She's the one whose home the murder has been announced to take place in. Always an interesting way to start the afternoon. And her childhood friend Dora Bunner, who has now at an older age come back to live with Letty. Letty Blacklock, for example, is a nice, no-nonsense, but generally warm-hearted woman who provides a much-needed counterbalance to all the rather scatterbrained folks surrounding her in Chipping Cleghorn. Dora Bunner being the first and potentially most scatterbrained of many such characters. Maybe the fact that I really enjoy the TV adaptation is telling, because in what adds up to just a little over 2 hours over the multiple episodes of this story in the TV adaptation, it feels like just the right length. Now, sometimes by contrast, I find that these books are so packed with excitement that the TV adaptations, especially the Poirot adaptations that are only an hour and a half long, feel rushed. But this one didn't feel rushed. If anything, it felt fairly slow-paced, and in a good kind of way. But that just shows that the actual meat of this novel is not 50% more than the average Agatha Christie novel, despite its length. I do think the way the whole mystery plays out, at least the core mystery, is appropriate and for the most part plausible. There are also some side mysteries, though, that are a bit more out there and frankly kind of bored me. All of this adding up to make a mystery that at the end of the day was still a little below average for me as Agatha Christie novels go, despite such a solid central plot. Just my opinion. So let's get to the spoilers now. A spoiler is announced in 5 seconds. So as I mentioned, I guessed this one rather early on, and I don't think it was that much of a stretch to guess this one, particularly if you've read another earlier published Agatha Christie mystery that I'm not going to name but used a rather similar device. How was I so sure about this one from early on, though? First of all, there is what to me is a very clear question that the detectives never ask, even once it becomes clear that everything is not as it seems here. Are we sure that this man, the victim Rudy Skertz, was not the intended victim? Everyone simply seems to take at face value Dora Bunner's inference that someone is trying to kill Letty Blacklock, even though we've already been told at this point multiple times that Bunny is very suggestible and not to be relied upon, and that there is clearly no support for this claim at the beginning, since whatever actually happened was obviously completely bungled, unless, of course, we assume Rudy was the intended victim, which is correct. And from this point on, despite Letty Blacklock being the most likely killer in that she is the one who owns the house at which the murder was committed, and therefore had the most knowledge and opportunity to arrange what fairly quickly emerges as a rather intricate murder setup, despite this, no one goes near her with a 10-foot pole. It's never even hinted that perhaps she's not to be trusted, except in very indirect ways. Now, admittedly, these indirect clues may help you to catch on eventually if you haven't already, such as the observation that no one really knows each other anymore in the village and a lack of positive evidence to identify Letty as the real Miss Blacklock, though Dora Bunner's seeming recognition of her as a childhood friend along with their shared experiences does present a difficulty here that I was never quite able to work out until it was revealed at the end. Still, I feel that this is one of the cases where the character is placed under so little suspicion that this may backfire for seasoned Christie readers if the goal is for us to identify the murderer by actual clues and deduction instead of by these sort of meta-level clues. Note, of course, that there are some of these clues scattered about as well. For example, it's revealed early on about Rudy Skirts that he at some point seemed to recognize Letty, although she denied it, which, if we're already thinking with the mindset that maybe he was the actual intended victim, that's another big hint. The fact that maybe they had some kind of connection or mutual recognition that she didn't want others to know about. Another thing that concerned me towards the start is that after the murder takes place, it quickly seems like it's going to turn into another one of these complicated memory puzzles where there's clues being thrown out left and right about what was happening in the room and what the geometry of the house was and which objects were where, what every person said about every other person, and how people moved in and out of each room where everything takes place. Of course, given that I was already pretty sure I'd figured out the murderer, I wasn't especially motivated to spend a lot of mental energy collecting and organizing all this info. And it turns out that this is okay, because at least in this novel, we really do tend to revisit most of the most interesting clues and observations. And Marple even draws our attention to them before the final reveal is made at the very end. Not only that, but here there are enough clues so that missing one here or one there is not really going to ruin your chances of figuring things out. So by the end, I did feel I at least had a pretty decent picture of how the whole setup was arranged, enough for me to figure out at least some of the additional details about how it all went down. Now, as for the side mysteries, there's this whole side thing going on for basically the whole novel, trying to figure out which of these people in the house is someone else in disguise. Given that I'd already identified that Miss Blacklock was probably a person in disguise, I didn't really care particularly much who else was here that was also in disguise, although I figured probably some other imposter would also be unmasked at some point too. And it turns out I was pretty justified in not caring, because although by the end of the novel we'll indeed have unmasked the mysterious Pip and Emma, if not the even more exclusive Sonia Gödler, who ends up being a red herring through and through, which is actually, in my opinion, a little more satisfying. Anyway, we've unmasked them, but aside from distracting us for another 2 hours, they play absolutely no role in the mystery other than to make things confusing, but again, not that confusing if you've already figured it out. How in the world were they also supposed to have randomly shown up out of the blue, unrecognized, both of them at the same time without recognizing each other? This is completely ridiculous, but also, like I may have already mentioned, it has no real bearing on anything other than that the two of them are going to be very, very rich at the end of the novel, even without having murdered anyone themselves, so that's a nice happy ending, I guess. Also, so there end up being 3 murders by the end. The third one, I admit, it adds a little more suspense and successfully prolongs the book by another hour while throwing out a decent clue, but it also is about the tackiest scenario we've seen for one of these late-breaking murders. The idea that Miss Blacklock happens to be snooping around listening in the exact right place at the right time, and then Hinch has to go pick up the dog from the vet or something ridiculous like that. I admit, though, if nothing else, this sort of melodramatic sequence is kind of funny just from the sheer ridiculousness of it, aside from that someone's getting murdered. And because as soon as Murgatroyd utters the key words to Hinchcliffe, you know she's done for it, even though you have to wait a few minutes to figure out just how she's going to meet her doom. In short, though, not the biggest fan of this one. I think this novel has some real potential and some good building blocks here and there, but it lacks the restraint and precision we see in some of Christie's finest works that isn't compensated here with more other interesting elements to keep it going. Why is this novel so beloved? Well, I think certainly one decisive factor must be that the solution itself has been deemed ingenious. And in a way it is, although the execution I personally think could have been done even better and has been done better in other Christie titles. But still, admittedly, the premise of pre-announcing the murder is pretty good. Everything else feels quite ordinary to me, if not even below average for me in some regards. Also, this particular murder solution, by the time Christie used it here, as I mentioned, was not quite as original as it could have been, because it did echo another particular novel of Christie's that I'd read a while ago that was published quite a bit earlier. So it just didn't feel strikingly original or surprising to me here, despite it still being a solid premise. And it sort of feels to me a bit like a Murder of Roger Ackroyd type novel, where there is a clever and unexpected aspect of it that earned it its reputation fairly, but if it weren't for that, it would actually be considered quite a bit more ordinary mystery, I think. Actually, though, Roger Ackroyd for me is better than this book. It actually would be fun for me to reread that one knowing the solution, whereas this one, not necessarily. I mean, that's why I found it dragged after I'd figured out what was going on so early on. All right, that's it for A Murder is Announced. Hopefully no one will announce my murder following this lukewarm reception to this beloved novel, but I'm just saying what I thought for this one. Let me know why I'm wrong, or better yet, why I'm right, and stay tuned for more Miss Marple at some point in the next 2 years. Next up is they do it with mirrors. A Murder by Mirror. That could be really exciting. Happy reading.